right now, and then hopefully some other people can join us as well as we continue. So good evening. My name is Kim Chi Tran, and I'm one of the MIG co-chairs, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today for our webinar about climate and anxiety. Of note, tonight's presentation is being recorded. So I'm certain that everyone here in the audience has felt despondent and likely anxious about climate change at some point or another. It seems as though so much is happening to the world around us, and yet we are reacting many orders of magnitude slower. With today's panel, we hope to tease apart the intersection of climate and anxiety through the lens of 3 different generations: Gen Z, Millennial, and Gen X. So first off, we have Natania Abibi, an experienced registered nurse with clinical expertise in mental and public health. She recently completed a double master's degree in nursing and public health at UBC, and now works as a clinical nurse specialist. Having worked in both Ontario and British Columbia, Natania's interests include health promotion, knowledge translation, planetary health, gender equality, anti-racist healthcare approaches, and media and health. Natania is also a filmmaker, and her film titled Just a Nurse has won an international film campaign sponsored by UN-affiliated agencies. Secondly, we have Max Silverman, who's a medical student at McMaster University, and he has a strong passion for environmental advocacy. He holds leadership and advocacy positions through our MIG, and also on the McMaster Medicine Student Council as VP Global Health. Ultimately, he seeks to empower those around him to engage in climate advocacy simply through the power of conversation. Last but not least, we have Dr. Gilly Adler-Neveu, one of our MIG co-chairs. She trained as a child psychiatrist in Israel before immigrating to Canada and completing a fellowship in child and adolescent anxiety at the Hospital for Sick Children. She's an assistant professor at the University of Toronto and leads the Michael Garron Child and Adolescent Anxiety Clinic. She believes in prevention, that is, being proactive as opposed to reactive. This conviction has led her not only to specialize in treating anxious youth in order to help them divert their life trajectory, but also to her work as co-chair of the MIG. Wearing these 2 hats, she is happy to speak to you about the intersection of the climate crisis and anxiety. So with that, I will let Max, Gilly, and Natania take it away.
Thank you so much, Kim Chi. Okay, just a second. Can you hear me good? Okay. So Max, slide 2, please. Okay, so today we'd like to understand more about eco-anxiety and how it affects each and every one of us through understanding anxiety better, through defining the climate crisis, and through seeing how they intersect. So the 3 of us, like Kim Chi said, Natania, Max, and I, we happen to be from different generations. And as we were talking and working for our talk, we realized that we have different experiences regarding the climate crisis, which we wanted to share with you. And also, of course, we would like to talk about what to do about all this anxiety. Okay, so Max, can you progress to slide 3? And then slide 4. Okay, so let's talk about my favorite subject is anxiety. I deal with it all the time. What is it? What is anxiety? People use the word anxiety in different ways, and I'd first like to make sure that we're all on the same page when we talk about anxiety. The common way to describe anxiety in psychiatry is according to 3 attributes: an emotion, a physical sensation, and a thought. So first, it's an emotion. And an emotion is not a cognition, it's not a thought. So if you think about it, it can't be defined in words, right? We all know what we talk about when we name a certain emotion. Like when I say anxious, you know what I'm talking about. But how can we know that we're feeling the exact same thing? How do I know that your red is my red? We have no way of knowing. So the best way to understand an emotion is through synonyms. So feeling anxious is like feeling scared, worried. It's a nervous feeling. Okay. The second part of anxiety are the physical sensations. So that's what our body feels like when we're anxious, like the heart pounding, it's hard to breathe, muscle tension, sweating, things like that. So that is the sympathetic nervous system kicking into action. Okay. The third attribution are the thoughts. So anxious thoughts, they're vague, negative, and future oriented, okay? And that's important. If you think about times when you are anxious, those are probably your thoughts. So together, the emotion, the physical sensations, and those vague, sort of future oriented, subjective thoughts make up anxiety. Okay? Slide 5, please. Okay. So let's talk about the history of anxiety a little bit, okay, to understand the context. A lot of people think that today is, this day and age is the age of anxiety, and that anxiety is more common now than it ever was before. Clearly, culture has changed, and we can talk more freely about mental health. So that leads to a sort of reporting bias. It makes us feel like there's more of it, more anxiety. But also, modern life is quicker, it's more connected. So we have less time to reflect and rejuvenate. And that may lead to more anxiety as well. So we may be more anxious now, but overall, it's not new. There's nothing new under the sun. Anxiety had been there forever. It's often mentioned in the Bible. It's mentioned in ancient civilization, in Greece, in Rome, in books, in culture. And so I just wanted to read one beautiful description of anxiety that is very relevant for today from the Bible, from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 28, verses 66, 67. And you can also read it in Hebrew if you'd like. So there, the Lord will give you a trembling heart, failing sight, and a despairing soul. So your life will hang in doubt before you, and you will be afraid night and day, never certain of survival. In the morning, you will say, if only it were evening, and in the evening, you will say, if only it were morning, because of the dread in your hearts. Okay, so slide 6, please. So the depth of the roots of anxiety and how endemic it is can be seen by the metamorphosis of the word. Anxiety in English evolved from anxietas in Latin, and that has roots in ancient Greek, ang, which evolved into angoisse in French. I'm sure I'm pronouncing it wrong, forgive me. Angoscia in Italian, angustia in Spanish, angst in German, and angst in Danish. It's all over the place. And there are more than 36 words to describe anxiety in English. And there's no language in the world that doesn't have ways to describe anxiety. And that's not true for all emotions. If you think about it, there are emotions that exist just in several languages and not in other languages. For example, Schadenfreude, that's the pleasure a person feels at the misfortune of others, and that exists only in German. So I hope it says something good about the English culture. So my point is that anxiety is central to being human. In the 1800s, Søren Kierkegaard, the philosopher, he thought of anxiety as the key to human existence, that sense of dread regarding freedom to choose. And from that evolved existential theory and philosophy and in psychiatry and in psychotherapy. So anxiety was considered there. It was unpleasant, but it was not a pathology. It became a pathology only in the early 20th century when Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, considered anxiety the cornerstone of psychopathology, and that's important. Okay. Max, can you progress to slide 7, please? Okay, so let's talk about fear a little bit. What is fear? Fear is very similar to anxiety with one main difference: the trigger, and so the thoughts. So you remember that the thoughts that trigger anxiety are sort of future oriented. They're often vague, so we don't know exactly what we're afraid of. They're often exaggerated and may not be realistic. And often they're a reaction to something personal, something internal. For example, I can be anxious when I see a dog, a cute little dog, because I was bitten by a dog once when I was a child, and not everybody's anxious about this dog. But fear, on the other hand, that's a red flag that calls to action. That's a trigger. It means that there's immediate danger. And the thoughts are outward focused. They're in the present moment, and they're often quite clear. So, for example, let's say, and this is completely hypothetical, never happened to me. Let's say I'm in Algonquin Park camping, and there's a bear 2 feet away from me. And my heart is pounding, and I can feel the cold sweat accumulating. What am I feeling there? I'm feeling fear, right? There's an actual danger, and I need to act. On the other hand, imagine a very similar situation. There's a bear 2 feet away from me, but I'm at the zoo, and there's a tall fence between me and the bear, and everyone around me is smiling and laughing, and no one seems to care. And still my heart is pounding, and I can feel the cold sweat accumulating. So it feels the same, but what am I feeling here? That's anxiety. So because this has something to do specifically with me, and I'm not in real danger, and I don't know exactly what I'm afraid of, and people around me don't seem to feel the same thing. So anxiety feels horrendous, really bad, and it's legitimate. But what we do about it differs from what we do about fear. When there's fear, we need to act on it. And when there's anxiety, we need to understand it, we need to validate it, and we need to help reduce it. Okay. And now, Max, if you can progress to slide 8. And now I'd like to scare you a little bit. Slide 9, please. So let's talk about the climate crisis. What is it? It is a situation characterized by the threat of highly dangerous, irreversible changes to the global climate. Slide 10, please. Let's talk about timeline a little bit. And this is not new. So scientists predicted the changes, including the exact weather events that we're experiencing now, for decades. In 1896, a Swedish chemist called Svante Arrhenius published the first prediction that the release of CO2 as a result of, back then it was just burning coal, will gradually warm the earth. And this was completely ignored. In the 1950s, so half a century later, people started to show interest again. And in 1960, a researcher called Syukuro Manabe, I'm probably butchering the name, forgive me, developed the first modern computer simulation of the climate. And that showed that Arrhenius was not far off base. And this started a new wave of scientific interest. In the 1970s, there was already a scientific consensus regarding the greenhouse effect. In the 1980s, scientists were sounding the alarm, and policymakers were completely ignoring it, but it was not yet a political issue. In 1988, the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was formed, and since then it had 7 assessment cycles. Slide 11, please. So this is a powerful image. It's taken from Greta Thunberg's, that's how she pronounces her name, not Thunberg. So it's taken from her book. It's called The Climate Book, and I highly recommend it. So you can see the temperatures rising in the same time as policymakers are continuing to do blah, 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 as she would describe it. And as a Gen Xer, I can tell you that it's a surreal experience for me. I clearly remember hearing the warning decades ago when it seemed like inconceivable that the planet can change, when there was still plenty of time to act, and seeing climate, which seemed to be just there, right? Just a fact, a stable, consistent fact, see it change right in front of my eyes. Slide 12, please. So extreme weather events are here. Slide 13. And they're causing unbalanced droughts and floods. They're causing food insecurity. They're causing mass migration. Slide 14, please. And every time we give this talk, this is the second actually, but we're hoping to do more. Every time we give this talk, there's a new extreme weather event to report, right? It's become the new normal. So I just put a few pictures of extreme climate events that happened close to home. This is Hurricane Fiona in Atlantic Canada from last September. Slide 15, please. And this is bomb cyclone Elliott in Fort Erie, Ontario, near Buffalo. This just past December. And slide 16, please. Remember the snow that just happened here in March. And this is, of course, just the tip of the iceberg. There's so many things happening all around the world. Slide 17, please. Okay. So now that we're on the same page regarding what anxiety is, as opposed to fear, and where we're standing regarding the climate crisis, let's see how they intersect. Okay. First, slide 18, please. Let's see if what's called eco-anxiety is that anxiety or fear. I wanted to look at two criteria. First, is it a response to an immediate danger or something vague in the future? And second, is it an internal subjective? Is it internal subjective or is it an external objective trigger? Slide 19, please. So, as you can see, we're currently experiencing the effect of the climate crisis. So we could say that the danger is immediate, but some people will say that the current extreme weather events, that's something that they can live with for the sake of comfort and modernity. But what we're really afraid of are future events. That's what we're afraid it will get worse. And the question is this something vague or is it a clearly validated by science? Is it a fact? So we mentioned the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that was established by the UN and is the leading international body for the assessment of climate change. For the 2022 report, for example, more than 66,000 peer-reviewed articles were analyzed by 782 scientists from 195 countries. So I don't see anything in our profession that has such a thorough validation. The report that just came out on March 2023, so just very recently, states, and I'm quoting, there is a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all with very high confidence. So there's plenty of evidence that we have until the end of this decade in order to prevent irreversible tipping points. And tipping points, that's a very important thing when we talk about the climate crisis and a positive feedback loop. And I would love to speak about it, but we don't have the time and the scope. You can read about it in the climate book, in Greta Thunberg's The Climate Book. So my conclusion is, yes, we're talking about future events, but they're extremely well validated. And so my conclusion is that we're facing an immediate and realistic danger. It's just disguised by slow motion. Slide 20, please. Now, is it internal or external? Is it subjective or something objective coming from the outside or inside? Let's see. I wanted to look at 4 criteria to understand where the intersection of anxiety and the climate crisis lands in each and every one of us. So I wanted to look at biological predisposition for anxiety, at our developmental level, at lifestyle, and at our political inclination. So let's look first at our biological predisposition. Slide 21, please. Okay. So we spoke about anxiety and fear as endemic, as going back in history since humans were able to record emotion. It is an integral, painful part of being human. Sometimes it's helpful and necessary. It's functional anxiety, and sometimes it's not. It's dysfunctional anxiety. But not all anxiety was created equal. And if we look at psychiatric diagnosis, the DSM is the book of psychiatric disorders, of course, and this is a list of all the anxiety diagnoses. So there's separation anxiety disorder, there's selective mutism, there's specific phobia, there's social anxiety disorder, there's panic disorder, there's agoraphobia, GAD, generalized anxiety disorder. So anxiety becomes a pathology when it's debilitating, when it impedes functioning, and when it causes extreme distress. So you can be shy, but you still don't have social phobia, social anxiety disorder. So each anxiety disorder has a different nature, right? It's different to have social anxiety and to have a fear of heights, for example. But what they do have in common, usually, is that there's a biological predisposition to anxiety, so often a certain inhibited, cautious temperament, and that's compounded by a developmental path that prevents coping. So there you have the nature and the nurture. And I've seen reports in many places that the climate crisis exacerbates pre-existing anxiety. And of course, that is sometimes true. But what I see a lot from my own clinical experience from my patients is that they can have a pathological, freezing, debilitating anxiety regarding their own subjective trigger. But a lot of times they have a very big conscience and they can really rise to the challenge when they face a real danger. So if we talk about us and where we intersect, some of us have a biological predisposition and have been able to cope well with our nature and decrease anxiety as we age. Still, we may tend towards that anxiety sensitivity. We can be more sensitive to just a kernel of real danger. And, sometimes we have a tendency to exaggerate it, but we can also be the canary in the coal mine. So that is a helpful thing to know about yourself. Are you a person who is less prone to anxiety and maybe oblivious to real signs of danger? Or are you the canary in the coal mine? Slide 22, please. And we can imagine anxiety as 2 layers, okay? So the bottom layer is the normal reaction to a realistic threat. So that functional reaction that pushes us to act. And this is the fear I was talking about. This is the part we'd like to maintain. Although it's distressing, we'd like to maintain that. And the top layer, that's the dysfunctional layer. That's the one that may be subjective, that freezes us into inaction This is the part that we would like to treat and alleviate the distress. That's the part that we'd like to sort of shave off. Okay. Next slide, slide 23, please. So let's talk about developmental level a little bit in our stage in life. That can really influence what we feel about the climate crisis. So overall, children tend to be more egocentric, which means focused on themselves. Not to confuse that with narcissistic or egoistic, which means that they don't care about others. They can really care about others, but they're focused on themselves. And this makes sense because we still need to develop and improve ourselves, and we don't necessarily have the capacity to help and support other people in the community. And world issues may pass over our heads when we're young, and we can be oblivious to the climate crisis. I find that if kids are really worried about the climate crisis, a lot of times that's anxiety. It doesn't have to be, but a lot of times that's the case. Teens and young adults have the mental capacity for critical thinking and also physical strength. But on the other hand, their habits are less entrenched than our old people habits, and they don't have responsibility to provide for families. And so often they're the ones who push for revolutions. And here you can see that this is the generation that is most anxious about the climate crisis and also most ready to make sacrifices. On the other hand, Gen Xers like me may be in the best position to act on climate, especially if we're in influential positions, which I'm definitely not. And especially if we don't need to care for a young family anymore, maybe we fulfilled our professional goals. So we're really in a good place to act. But as you can see here, the older generations are less anxious about climate and less ready to sacrifice. Slide 24, please. So what about lifestyle? That's important too. So if nature, hiking, homesteading, organic farming, this is what we like to do anyway. There's less we would need to give up and more to lose when we think about the climate crisis. The man in the photo is Brent Preston, who I know a little bit, and his wife, Jillian Flies, was actually one of our presenters in the speaker series. So you can go to our website and see the webinar that she spoke in. So they left a comfy executive positions in downtown Toronto to become organic farmers right here north of Toronto in Malmar. And so they're living the life of their dreams and acting on climate at the same time. Next slide, slide 25, please. But what if it is not part of your lifestyle and the things that bring you joy and comfort are harmful to the planet? That's a different story then. And it's very difficult to have to make really drastic changes to the way you live for climate, and can be really infuriating if someone tells you that you have to give up your way of life, especially if it's for something that you don't really understand and you're not convinced that it's the right thing to do. Next slide, slide 26, please. And what if you're finding it really hard just to survive and there's no place in your life for another thing to stress about and you don't have energy reserves anyway to do something about it? So lifestyle is important. Slide 27, please. So we spoke about the intersection of the climate crisis with a predisposition towards anxiety, with our developmental level, with our lifestyle, and let's talk a bit about politics. So I realize that this is a touchy subject, and I'll try to tread lightly. It's clear to me that the climate crisis is an objective scientific reality. And theoretically, it's as political as advocating for, like, let's say, a cure for cancer or wearing a seatbelt. It shouldn't be political in that sense. But obviously it is. And you may be surprised to hear that it wasn't always that way. It wasn't always a hot political topic. And I wanted you to let you hear something really cool. So I hope you can hear this.
Canadian politics is also American politics. Listen to this.
Hi, I'm Nancy Pelosi, lifelong Democrat and Speaker of the House.
And I'm Newt Gingrich, lifelong Republican, and I used to be Speaker.
We don't always see eye to eye, do we, Newt?
No, but we do agree our country must take action to address climate change.
We need cleaner forms of energy and we need them fast.
If enough of us demand action from our leaders, we can spark the innovation we need.
Go to wecansolveit.org. Together, we can do this.
Now, in this day and age, that sounds like
That's from What's on Earth podcast that I recommend also. I think that's really cool and beautiful to hear, and what a pity it doesn't happen this way now. But regardless, people tend to be less anxious and less involved with the climate crisis when they're on the right side of the political spectrum for some reason. And this is a phenomenon that is true worldwide. Okay, so that's important in the intersection. Next slide 28, please. So a bit of self-disclosure, where am I in the intersection of the climate crisis and anxiety? Before that, before where I'm at, I'd like you to think about where you are. Okay, I'll self-disclose, but think about where you are regarding all these aspects in the intersection of climate and anxiety. So where I'm at, these are signs that I made for demonstrations that I participated in, and I can guess just by me speaking here in my role here that you can understand where I stand. I think I do have a tendency towards biological anxiety, and that's that I've learned to cope with over the years, and that's why I work with anxious kids to help them cope with that as well. I also, I confess that I'm a tree hugger and I'm a nature lover, but I think it's important, and I do believe that loving nature and loving people go hand in hand, and that caring for the planet and caring for people is a win-win situation. It's not a zero-sum game, which sometimes you will hear. Clearly, people cannot live without nature and without a planet. And I'm pretty old. I'm a Gen Xer. My kids are in university. And so I'm trying to pull my weight for issues that I believe are important. Also, as you heard, I immigrated to Canada in 2003, and I immigrated from a snow-deprived country, from Israel. And I remember, is someone saying something? I thought someone said. So I remember that when I immigrated to Canada, I remembered how beautiful the winters were. It was a full winter of snow, and it never occurred to me just 20 years ago that the winters will change over my lifetime. And this is a change that the younger generation doesn't even realize occurred. They think winters have always been like this, and that is unbelievable. Regarding politics, I don't know. What do you think? What my political inclination is? I'll leave it there. I'll let you guess. So my bottom line is this: where my life intersects with the climate crisis may make me more sensitive to it, and I realize that. Also, it can make it easier for me to act on climate, and I realize that as well when I talk with other people. Okay, and I'll now pass to Natanya to speak about the anxiety terms specific to the climate crisis and about her own journey.
Okay, great. So this portion of the presentation is focusing more on what we call psychoterratic syndromes, also known as climate-related emotions. So we'll be focusing more on what eco-anxiety actually is, as well as other terms like ecological grief and eco-paralysis. So we'll go to the next slide. Okay, so I think maybe it's good to start off with a little background about, how I got involved with climate change work in general as a nurse. So I've always been personally interested in addressing, climate change in my own personal life, but I got more invested when I started being involved in the health impacts of climate change course at UBC. And in that course, we basically cover various topics related to climate change and health. And I would lead a lecture every year on the mental health impacts of climate change. And I noticed that a lot of students had really high amounts of fear regarding the future of the planet. And, I couldn't blame them. And the other thing I noticed was that they weren't just talking about climate change in the sense of, the fear that they felt in terms of the future, but also how climate change was enmeshed with so many other things that youth are faced with today, such as things like racism and capitalism and ageism. And like Dr. Adler was saying before, certain generations perhaps have more likelihood of being, care more about climate change. And it was very evident also what the students were saying in terms of what the research literature is saying. So, for example, youth between the ages of 10 to 26 often endure higher levels of stress and are more likely to report increased mental health concerns with respect to climate change. And so in response to this, I actually created a documentary that features the voices of youth, but also other healthcare professionals some of you may recognize, such as Dr. Melissa Lem, and Dr. Courtney Howard. And so we'll go with the first psychoterratic syndrome, which is eco-anxiety. And I thought it would be great if we could also provide clips from the film, which you guys can also watch if you just Google on YouTube. So we'll go to the next slide. So this slide here, we're going to be talking a little bit about eco-anxiety, and we're going to hear about Emily's story.
I see my place in the world in terms of mitigating climate change in two perspectives.
This is not the correct one, eh, Natanya?
No.
Sorry,
So
one sec. Yeah, am I getting up mixed up? Okay, should be this one then. We might have to come back. Huh. Okay. Do you know the timestamp? And I could just scroll to Emily's story.
Okay, it's from 2:28 to 3:38.
Okay.
I see my place in the world through a lot of.
Sorry, guys.
My name is Emily, and I'm a second-year student at UBC studying integrated environmental health. So for a large part of my life, I grew up in a really big city in China. And I remember there being a lot of air pollution where I lived. So basically, whenever you looked into the horizon, there was a lot of smog. On a winter day, there'd be so much haze in the sky, and you could barely see, like when I was living in an apartment, I could barely see the apartment next door. So when my family immigrated to Canada, I was so surprised and so shocked at how incredibly clear the skies were and how little smog there was on the horizons. And you could really see far away the mountains, the snow caps of the mountains. Recently, when there are forest fires in the summer and you see like fires coming in with smoke from interior BC or from California, and the skies would be hazy again. And it would just be kind of scary, and I'd feel a little bit anxious about it. When I think back to that and how much air pollution I was constantly being exposed to, it just shocks me how much one's environment can have, like how much impact one's environment can have on their health.
Do you know what's really interesting?
Great. So as you guys can see from Emily's story, eco-anxiety really is, it's defined as a chronic fear of environmental doom. And, many people these days are inundated by climate change news that tells us about the negative trends in the environment. And it's unsurprising that many people have fear about a future world that could be potentially desolated. One of the things that's very interesting in the research literature is that people who tend to have eco-anxiety need a high degree of structure in their life, but also people have reported that eco-anxiety can manifest as physical reactions such as, let's say, loss of appetite and insomnia. And so the next climate-related emotion we'll talk about is ecological grief. So I'll talk a little bit about ecological grief, and then we can watch a clip from the documentary. So ecological grief is a natural response individuals have in reaction to environmental loss and altered landscapes, which provide people meaning. And one of the things I'll just mention is that there are various types of ecological grief that go beyond, the bereavement related to changes in the natural environment. So for example, it could be the grief related to the loss of environmental knowledge, which is tied to broader social determinants of health, such as cultural identity. And the negative, consequences of ecological grief are both, it's the erosion of both personal and communal sense of identity and feelings of lack of control. So if we, try to contextualize this within, our own country and in a country in the global north, such as Canada, we see the impact of things like colonialism and climate change negatively affecting Indigenous peoples. So for example, climate change has destabilized the housing foundations of Inuit communities in the Arctic, which has impaired their ability to partake, for example, in transportation or hunt for food sources. And as a result, has led to feelings of, loss of identity and sense of place, which in turn leads to ecological grief. And so we'll look at a clip here from Lauren on her ecological grief.
There. I'm Lauren, and I just finished studying kinesiology at UBC. A personal example of eco-grief within my community is the changes within the natural environment, such as the forest that I used to walk around in. Prior to going to university, I used to spend a lot of time here to de-stress and relax, as I find the nature really calms me down. However, now coming back from university, all this land has been changed into housing development, and it's really just sad to see. I think power is definitely relevant to one's mental health, just because when we feel like we have a lot of power, we perceive that we have a lot of control over the situation. And that's why it's so relevant when we bring up our ability to respond to the climate crisis, just because I feel like a lot of people don't believe that we have the ability and control to make a difference. But I think educators need to really promote that we do actually can make a difference within these micro scale actions such as composting.
So the last earth emotion we're going to talk about is eco-paralysis. And I'm sure most people in the audience might have felt a certain degree of eco-paralysis at some point in their life. And really what it is, it's a feeling as though you're not able to take effective action to mitigate climate change. And it's commonly linked to feelings of powerlessness, which can sometimes be mistaken as a form of apathy or complacency or disengagement. So an example of what this might look like is people not necessarily partaking in pro-social behaviors like reducing electric consumption because they don't really see the value in this behavioral change. They might say things like, well, it's up to the government to take action. I'm just one person in a big world. How am I supposed to, fix the climate crisis? Or for example, people who, they might do things like compost and all that stuff, but then they'll still maybe perhaps order things on Amazon or fast fashion companies like Shein. And so we'll include the final clip here by Sarah and listen to her story about eco-paralysis.
My name is Zara Fazal. I'm studying global health and nutrition in my final year at the University of British Columbia. The tension between individual and societal responsibility is something that I really relate to, and it has really impacted me in terms of how much I can and will get involved with when it comes to the climate movement. And so at times, eco-paralysis for me means that I look at it as I'm working in a system where maybe the responsibility of the system and the priorities of the system aren't geared as much on climate justice because they're more pressing matters that are grabbing the attention of public health. And that becomes really difficult because then you feel like, no matter what I do, no matter how much advocacy I try to take part in, the system isn't built to really respond to climate issues at the moment. And that isn't to say that it is always the system's fault. For example, in Tanzania, which is the country I grew up in, there's so many other issues every single day that are claiming the lives of the people. So there is a bias towards other issues. And so for someone who works in public health, it becomes really hard to navigate the balance of all of this. But when I think of ecological paralysis, the one thing I try to do is understand that we sometimes fall in the trap of blaming the system or blaming the government, and that takes away and dilutes from the individual responsibility we have. And that is what is really dangerous. So when I try to think of it, even though I might be working in a system that isn't supportive, I try to think of it as what is something I can do every day to be grateful for how much Earth has sustained me so far, instead of thinking about the future that could cause anxiety for me.
So one thing I'll just mention is that these terms like eco-anxiety, eco-paralysis, eco-grief are gaining a lot more traction. And I think part of it is because youth are looking for ways to describe what they're feeling. One thing to mention is that these are not necessarily mental illnesses, right? So you're not going to see it in the DSM-5. Dr. Adler is not going to diagnose her patients with eco-paralysis. But the main thing is that by naming your emotion, then you're able to then take effective action and evaluate your thoughts around the situation that you're feeling. And so with that, I will leave it to Max.
Okay, thank you so much, Gillian and Tanya. So just a brief introduction. My name is Max. I'm 23, and I'm currently studying my second year at McMaster Medical School. I grew up in Ottawa. I completed my undergrad at Queen's, and now happy to be continuing my education here in Hamilton. So there are many things that I'm really passionate about. And as Kimchi mentioned at the beginning, probably the biggest topic that I just can't seem to shake my passion for is everything and anything climate change related, although medicine is creeping up to a close second. So if you ask any of my family or friends, they'll probably complain about how I somehow always manage to sneak climate change into any conversation. So when planning with Natanya and Gilly to give this talk today, I was challenged to think of my personal climate journey and how I got to this point of being a self-described climate advocate. So on reflection, I don't think there was any real aha moment, whether I took a certain class or read a certain article or book or anything like that. Rather, I think that climate change was just this big, scary idea that was always present and looming over me. And instead of shying away and becoming paralyzed, as Natanya was just speaking about, instead, at some point along this journey, I decided to just jump in and embrace it. I've tried to learn as much as I can about the science, the politics, and the economics driving climate change, as well as the solutions being discussed and implemented already. And importantly, the huge barriers that make climate change such a challenging global issue. So it wasn't some overnight change in me, I think, but a gradual interest that has just continued to grow and grow. And I really think that this journey that I just described is not unique among my fellow Gen Zers. We all grew up in a world where human-caused climate change was accepted as fact, by most at least, rather than as some point of debate. There's still questions about what we as a society were going to do about it, but the existence of this widespread ecological destruction, mass extinctions, and fast approaching irreversible tipping points, these weren't in doubt by anyone who would just open their phone or their computer and look into it. So the real question that I think many in my generation ask themselves is, what are we going to do about this? And what can we do about this? There are no easy answers. So this instantaneous access to seemingly endless information, combined with the impending total ecological collapse, was a real recipe for climate anxiety in my generation, which is what I want to talk about in a little bit more depth now. So this quote that you can read on the slide is from an article in the Lancet Planetary Health, and it encapsulates a key fact when it comes to discussing climate and the young and future generations to come. So it's fairly easy to understand why children and the youth are disproportionately affected by climate change. It's a slow process, and we're going to live with the climate crisis and its consequences our whole lives. We'll experience the direct negative effects that Gilly mentioned at the beginning, in addition to all these indirect effects, some of which we can't even predict yet, but we know that these will all just worsen with time. Even if we miraculously stopped emitting CO2 tomorrow or other greenhouse gases, the planet will still continue to warm for the years to come due to all the previous emissions that are going to be hanging around for a long time. So, understanding all of this as a fact, it's no surprise that climate anxiety is also disproportionately higher among young people. So I'd first like to speak to my personal experience with this and what I've managed to glean through my many interactions, some forced, with friends and family. I know this isn't a scientific method of data collection, but I will get to that soon. So in broad strokes, it seems to me, in my life at least, that there are two camps of people when it comes to thinking about climate change, represented by the lovely graphics on the slide here. So neither group denies the legitimacy and real threat posed by climate change, but the real difference is in their response. While one group is deeply concerned and scared about their future, the other remains indifferent, preferring to focus their energy and attention on the millions of other things going on in the world and in their own personal lives. Fair enough. But my goal in these conversations is to get my friends to be more like the girl on the left here. I know it may sound mean. The guy on the right looks much happier and quite unbothered, but the reality is this. Climate change and its effects are devastating, and we as youth know that if we just stick our head in the sands and pretend it doesn't exist, things can only get worse. But I want to get these friends and family in these conversations to that sweet spot of climate fear, not debilitating anxiety, which we hope has been clearly differentiated today. Hopefully that this fear can inspire climate action. We know denial doesn't help anyone in the long run. But putting my personal impressions aside, there is a growing body of scientific evidence that is aiming to quantify climate anxiety among young adults. And the results are suggesting that quite a large portion of the youth are actually following in the camp of the girl on the left. So I know it's quite a complicated slide here, but I'm going to break it down. So this is from a 2021 Lancet study, which the authors enlisted 10,000 participants, 1,000 from each of the 10 countries listed here that are aged between 16 and 25. Very importantly, the study included perspectives from youth and young adults from a wide variety of countries with geographic, cultural, and socioeconomic diversity. The research group sought out to assess young adults' feelings associated with climate change through this comprehensive global survey. They also went on to relate these feelings to the respondents' perceived adequacy of the government's response to climate change, or often the lack thereof. So sharing just some key facts to get the points across. Looking at this graph on the top, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but highlighting all countries, almost 60% of respondents across these 10,000 participants said that they felt either very worried or extremely worried about climate change. Participants identified most with emotions of sadness, powerlessness, anxiety, fear, and anger. Emotions least often represented were optimism and indifference. 75% feel that the future is frightening, while 83% feel that people have failed to take care of the planet. Nearly 40% expressed hesitancy about having children in their lives. Perhaps unsurprisingly, they also found that distress appears to be greater when young people believe their government's response is inadequate. So some sort of broad takeaways that I've listed on the left here, first focusing on the second actually, is the difference in findings among countries in the global north, such as us, the US, the UK. So these countries who have contributed the most to the problem and yet benefit most from the industrialized world versus the findings in the global south who stand to bear and are currently bearing the brunt of impacts while having contributed the least to the problem. There is a huge difference among these findings. So this is another hugely important topic that warrants its own complete discussion, which I feel is out of scope today, but I did want to highlight it. But the number one takeaway that I've listed here is that young people are extremely worried when it comes to climate change. It seems, from this data at least, that most youths around the world appear to land in the category of the girl on the left. We are worried about our future. While this may seem just sad, I prefer a more optimistic outlook. This means that young people care. We want something better. And I think with a boost from some healthy and well-justified climate fear, we're likely to take the action to make it better. In fact, I'd argue that this is already well underway. Inspiring young climate activists like Greta Thunberg and Luisa Neubauer have lit the fire under politicians and corporations, and strides are being taken by so many young climate activists across the world. Change is upon us. And I think that turning this wave that we just went over of climate fear being felt by the world's youth into climate action is a critical step in making real system-wide change. A quote from the Lancet article that I quite like reads as follows: "Current narratives risk individualizing the so-called problem of climate anxiety, with suggestions that the best response is for the individual to take action. Our results suggest that such action needs to particularly be taken by those in power. I firmly believe that it will fall on the young generation, as it has so many times in the past, to demand the real system-level change that we so desperately need. And I think we're going to rise to that occasion." So in our last section of the presentation, we're now going to share our toolbox for handling climate anxiety, as well as some of the individual and collective actions that we're taking to confront it. So I'll pass it off to Gilly here just to sum us up before we get into that.
Thank you so much, Max. And I think what you said is so important that, and we'll talk about it more later on, but I just want to emphasize it, that bottom up and top down at the same time. So individual actions, but most important is for the people in power to act. Okay. So let's summarize. What did we do up until now? We defined anxiety and fear. And as Max said, the fear is something we want to maintain. If you feel you're not afraid, then think again. We provided scientific evidence that the climate crisis is happening now, that it's man-made, and that the trajectory is clear, which means that at least part of what we're dealing with in respect to the climate is fear, not anxiety. And we provided tools for each of us to identify where we stand in the intersection of climate and anxiety. For each of us to understand if we're dealing with fear in our specific case or anxiety. We further understood the eco-specific anxiety terms. We understood that these are normal rather than pathological, even if distressing, and that we'd really want to be, if we really want to be accurate, they are actually fear and not anxiety. And we also, I hope you understood our different viewpoints from a generational perspective as well. Okay, now, Max, if you can proceed to slide 43, to the next slide. Let's talk about what to do about it, what to do about our anxiety or fear. So slide 44, please. So every therapy starts with insight. Understand where you stand in the intersection. Is it fear or anxiety? So if you feel you're extremely distressed to the point that it's impeding your functioning and your mood and your enjoyment of life, there may be that anxiety component that we talked at the top level, on top of that fear. And then, the scope of this talk is definitely not sufficient. Then professional help can be really helpful. I do suggest that. Also, if you don't feel anxious at all, maybe this is a time for insight, to realize maybe that's because of denial. Maybe you're avoiding the issue. And in this case, not to be afraid to feel that fear. We're here with you, and we're here to support you. Next slide, 45, please. We talked about those physical sensations, and they can be really distressing. And there are multiple effective ways to reduce physiological stress. I'm a psychiatrist, but I like prescribing medication less than other ways of dealing with anxiety, and I'm a big proponent of diaphragmatic breathing. This can be really, really effective. It can be more effective than medication if it's done correctly. A lot of people don't know how to breathe. Again, this is not the scope of this presentation, but if you go on our website, the Michael Garron Hospital Child and Adolescent Anxiety Clinic, you'll see there are videos there that explain how to do diaphragmatic breathing correctly. Okay, let's proceed to the next slide, 46. Now, let's talk about thoughts a little bit. Catastrophic thinking, black and white thinking, overgeneralization, perfectionism, those happen a lot when we think about climate. And these are called cognitive distortions. They're unrealistic patterns of thinking that we all fall into sometimes, and they are very rigid in nature and very extreme, and that makes them unrealistic and anxiety provoking. So sometimes when we realize that we're falling into this pattern of cognitive distortion, that is helpful for us to feel less anxious about it, right? So I love catastrophizing. So I tell myself, okay, Gilly, stop catastrophizing. And then I'm bringing myself down to earth, and that can be really helpful. Next slide, slide 47, please. An important piece is acceptance. I don't know if you're familiar, it's very well known with the Serenity Prayer. So it goes something like this. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And I think that is so relevant for climate change and climate anxiety. Another tip that can help us accept things is taken from dialectical behavioral therapy, and that is practicing our ability to hold two opposing views in our minds at the same time and accept both of them. So as humans, we're not logical. We don't need to be logical. Our mind is not a computer, and the world is complicated. So definitely we can hold two opposing views at the same time. And when it comes to climate change, I think it's helpful for me to hold the notion, on the one hand, that the climate crisis is an emergency. It should be treated like an emergency. We shouldn't be lying on our laurels. And at the same time, forgive yourself and realize that you're only one person and you can't do more than your best, and that we each have a role to play, a different role to play, and none of us can do it all by ourselves. And what we can do, though, and we can use the intersection of anxiety and the climate crisis, is to create our own narrative, to create our own story, to understand where we are specifically at this intersection. And that can give us meaning. Okay, it's really helpful to do something meaningful about it. Next slide, please. So this is the anxiety equation. I hope you remember a bit of math. If you think about a simple fraction, when the denominator is large, then what happens to the overall number? It becomes small. But when the denominator is small, the overall number becomes large, right? So this makes it very clear. Okay, if we take the danger, it stays the same. The numerator is the danger, it stays the same. But if we believe that we can cope, if we believe that we can do something, our anxiety becomes very small, it decreases. If we don't, the anxiety is very large. So doing something about it and doing it together and believing we can do this is the most helpful method to reduce anxiety. And as you can see, that's what we're all doing right now. Next slide, please. So all this is we've been talking a lot, but people often ask, what are the practical guidelines? What can we actually do to empower ourselves and show that we can cope? We make 30,000 decisions every day, a lot, and not all can be sustainable. For example, I'm certainly not Greta Thunberg, and a lot of my decisions are not sustainable. We shouldn't fall into the perfectionist thinking trap. Not the cognitive distortion of all or nothing. But what we can do is have climate always at the back of our minds. And always, when we can, make the decision that is sustainable, that is climate informed. There are a few guidelines that can help us do that. If you can move to the next slide, slide 51. So I'm sure you're familiar with the R's. When I first heard of the R's, there were 3. And as you can see here, the slide talks about 7 R's. If you count, there are 9. That's because I just invented 2 more. Represent, I think, is an important one that I just added. But if we want to highlight the most important, I would say that refuse is the most important, and recycling is the least. Now people talk about even not recycling at all, because only 5% actually gets recycled, and probably gets recycled once or maximum twice. So we can view single-use plastic as garbage. But I do want to say that I do feel it's really important still to recycle. I'm very adamant about recycling myself, because the habit is important. To maintain the infrastructure of recycling is important, because it waxes and wanes, and it's really important for us to have that in place in case it gets better as well. Going back to the IPCC report, this latest report from March, it states that the top 10 socioeconomic percent of people, and definitely all of us here are part of that 10%, we account for 35 to 45% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And that is important. So I'm not against being guilty. I'm Jewish. I'm very used to being guilty. And it's a good emotion, because it, like anxiety, it feels uncomfortable, but it pushes us to act. So that's just something to think about, and still hold those 2 things in your mind at the same time. Okay. Next slide, please. Slide 52. I find these very helpful guidelines as well. They're taken from the climate book, from Greta's book as well, the 1.5 degree lifestyle. Can I tell you that I'm doing it all now? Absolutely not. But I'm trying to get as close as I can. It's a journey. And as long as we're getting closer, I feel that that is helpful as well. From the book also, if someone asks you what is the one action they can take, which would be most impactful, and where to start, that would be dropping red meat, for example, just that, and not purchasing fast fashion. So instead, buying secondhand, or saving, fashion comes into style again, saving your old items for years and then coming back to them, or buying good quality items and not a lot of them. If you're looking for low-hanging fruit, something that really wouldn't affect you almost at all, it's things like never idling, and advocating for never idling. Idling can be 1.5% of greenhouse gas emissions, just there. Or saying no to single-use items that are offered to you. So that doesn't impact your life at all and makes a difference. But ultimately, like Max said, and I was thinking about what Zara said in Natanya's movie as well. It's important for us to be conscientious and act. But as individuals, we cannot solve the climate crisis. What we can do, especially as physicians, is serve as role models. And the more people join us, the closer we get to a different tipping point, the tipping point of public opinion. And once we get there, it will create a real difference. It will make governments act and industry change. And that is where we want to get to. And with this, I'll hand it back to Max.
Okay, thank you so much, Gilly. And it's incredible to hear about, all of these guidelines for the individual actions that, we can all take and are being taken by my co-presenters here today. I hope that some of these resonate or inspire you all to take, similar practices in your own lives. Personally, I do try my best to minimize my individual carbon footprint whenever I can, but the reality is I'm very far from perfect. I try to bike or walk when the weather's nice, which I've been doing these past few weeks. And I've recently been very focused on reducing my meat consumption and cooking with plant-based proteins. But, I have a gas engine car. I went on a plane over the December break, and I still buy and cook meat, to name just a few things. And yet, I still consider myself to be a climate advocate. And I want to encourage anyone who cares about the climate to do the same, regardless of how big or small your personal carbon footprint may be. I'd argue, as Gilly was just mentioning, that what's even more important than your individual actions to reduce that carbon footprint is engaging in these so-called collective actions. And when I'm talking about collective actions, I'm really talking about politics. I know, as Gilly also mentioned, this word has grown to have a bit of a negative connotation for a lot of people, but my definition may be slightly different than what you're thinking of. I don't think politics is just about voting for the people that will prioritize climate action within our government, though this is also incredibly important and valuable. To me, politics is quite simply talking to those around you about the things that you care about. It's about engaging with family, friends, and colleagues and seeking to make a difference in what they care about. And when done right, I think that from a climate change perspective, this is actually the single most important action that you can take. So I'll share with you all a quick example on my take on collective action. Or remember that this can be done in a million different ways, both big and small. So healthcare, it's not the first industry that comes to mind when people think about large carbon emitting sectors. It's no agriculture or energy or transportation. And yet in Canada, still actually makes up around 5% of our total carbon emissions. This is no small amount. And if we want to stay within the 1.5 degrees of warming as agreed upon in the Paris Accords, it needs to be reduced. So as a medical student, I was elected as VP Global Health on the Student Council, with my platform being centered around climate change and greening healthcare. I joined this very Green is Health interest group with the OMA, and we send newsletters and coordinate webinars such as this one to facilitate discourse around climate change for doctors, among other advocacy work. And I plan on continuing beyond medical school to engage with hospital system leaders in my future place of work on how we can all reduce our carbon footprint. Just by organizing as a group of individuals who care and letting your voices be heard together can have an incredibly outsized impact than doing it alone. This is especially true of physicians. We are privileged to hold positions of trust and credibility within society. When doctors and organizations such as the OMA demonstrate a united front on matters of population-level health and well-being, which climate change absolutely is, people, including politicians, truly listen. Just think back to the huge impact of physician advocacy on anti-tobacco legislation. This is why I believe that we have a duty to wield this privilege to be both role models and advocates for other industries and individuals when it comes to climate action. So with this in mind, the Green is Health Interest Group is very excited to announce a brand new initiative. We want to recruit a network of climate leads for each OMA section. Our hope is that these section leads can serve as a point person between OMA leadership and colleagues within their section who are looking to green their practice. These leads will have the opportunity to work together on bigger initiatives and more independently with ideas more confined to their specific areas of practice. Roles will include collecting feedback from colleagues, facilitating communication and collaboration across sections, and serving as the spokesperson for your section on climate issues within healthcare. This initiative is still very much in development, but if you or someone that you know may be interested, please fill out or pass along this Google form. The link is going to be sent in the chat right now so that we can reach out to you and discuss this opportunity further. I'm personally excited to be taking on the role as the medical student section lead, and I hope to connect with some of you in the near future so that together we can show that Ontario doctors will not sit back idly and watch as our climate collapses. So before ending the presentation and opening to questions, I want to share a powerful quote from the inspirational Greta Thunberg, featured very heavily in our talk today, who I think embodies the Gen Z no-nonsense approach to climate advocacy so well. She states in the closing chapter of her new climate book the following: "The climate crisis cannot be solved within today's systems, but that must not stop us from taking whatever action we can right now." Thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Gilly, Max, and Natanya. At this point in time, we'd like to open up the floor for any sort of questions, and I encourage you to put your video screen on if you're so inclined, and we can go through the questions as they come.
I just want to point one thing before questions, that Max is going to be our lead for the students, and Stephanie Tom joined us, and she already volunteered to be the lead for rheumatology. Stephanie, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hi.
Okay, so thank you so much for volunteering. So we hope that a lot of people will follow your lead.
For sure. So I'm working with, I'm collaborating with a bunch of groups in terms of coming up with an ambulatory care toolkit to green our workplaces. So if anyone's interested or already working on it, please get in touch so that we can join forces.
Wonderful. That's amazing. Open to questions or more volunteers. I think James Deutsch had the question in the chat.
Yeah, I don't want to rain on the parade, but you know, I really appreciate what you're doing, and I think, you know, as a psychiatrist, I have to work with where people are at and really listen. So I've been listening tonight, and I really appreciate. I've certainly learned some things about some of the thoughts people are having about the coping and the apprehending of reality. Sorry, but what I wanted to point out is that I think, Max, you were saying earlier, what you were implying is that we're going to go past 1.5, but I noticed this kind of mantra that's, you know, it's hegemonic. It's in the water we swim in, really, in the media and in many discussions, and even Greta Thunberg herself will refer to Paris and 1.5. But I was involved in teaching climate science, I think in 2009 at U of T and 2010 to undergraduates, and it was really quite clear at that point that climate is really not just about temperature in the air, it's about ocean and atmospheric circulation patterns that are being disrupted, so that you can be freezing in May in Toronto, but that doesn't mean that there's no global heating. It's really what James Hansen says. It's about the energy imbalance, about the energy coming in from the sun and the energy that's managing to be radiated back out into space against the absorption of the greenhouse gases. So what I pointed out in my comment is that there are feedbacks, dozens of feedbacks now, many of which are not in the climate models, because they haven't really been fully identified. There's a lot of heat in the ocean. Most of the excess heat is in the oceans, but there's only so much that the oceans can contain, and the stratification of the ocean in terms of the surface layers and the lower layers is being disrupted, as are the Atlantic and meridional circulation and the Antarctic circulation, and the patterns in the Pacific as well, the El Nino oscillation. So I think it's important to be realistic about this and to look at why have things not happened. I'm from the States originally, which is it's quite well covered in the media how reluctant politicians are to act. And if you look at the way the American democracy works, it's very dependent on donations, which are incredibly small compared to the amounts that would actually make a difference in the climate. We have a Canadian version of that as well, in terms of the fossil fuel industries and the military as well, which is a major greenhouse gas emitter. So anyway, I'll just keep it at that, but that's pretty much what I was lecturing on over 10 years ago.
All very true. I was nodding all along. What was your question?
So when I speak with youth about concern about climate, I certainly want to help them to manage, to keep their minds on track. But to what degree do you include reality, like their, not just their anxiety, but their outrage as well?
It's such a good question. I hope I hope I answered it. So I think an important point as a child psychiatrist is to include age. So I wouldn't scare very young children. But from the point that people can understand, I think we need to look at reality full blown. And we need to feel the fear. That's what I was trying to say. We don't want to lie on our laurels. We're here, we're talking about it, we're all calm. We're talking, for us, it's something we talk about all day long, but we don't completely want to desensitize ourselves to that. We want to maintain the fear and talk about it full blown, but take out that anxiety piece that paralyzes us, and keep that fear that helps us do something about it. And at the same time, not think that we can't enjoy life at the same time. Okay, do that DBT, do that, right. Holding those two things.
And the DBT has to validate where they're coming from. I work primarily with a traumatized young population. So before I help them to contain their anxiety, I want to listen to them. And I think that's the same, what you're saying is don't minimize their concerns. When they bring it to you, we have to listen.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. Absolutely. And remember that anxiety equation. So anything that we do is important, and within our narrative. So what can we do in our life that contributes, and how can we sound the alarm so little by little public opinion will change, or fast. Fast is better than little by little. Yeah.
Yeah.
A couple comments here in the chat. So Howard Eisenberg mentions that he has a new book about empowerment called Dream It to Do It, The Science and the Magic. So I think that could be a worthwhile tool to help some people who want to sort of manifest their destiny. And then Karen also mentions that there are other ways that physicians can make impacts in terms of personal choices. So sustainable investing is a big one, and we've had webinars on that as well. So if you properly invest a portfolio that can offset more carbon, then some other things that we could do. And so she points out, for example, plant-based diets, living car free, avoiding flights, having one less child. And so she has a link there as well. And then throughout our chat, actually, we have a lot of really useful links that the participants have all sort of put in there. I did have a question for Gilly. So in your years of practice, have you seen a shift towards more of a climate anxiety or climate fears dialogue, like in your sessions with your patients?
Almost all my patients have climate anxiety. Usually the part we're treating is not the climate anxiety per se. So they would have social anxiety, or they will have OCD, or they will have panic attacks. So that's what we would be treating. But a lot of times that's the kernel that I was talking about, the biological anxiety, which I feel exists in me as well. That canary in the coal mine, were more sensitive. So my patient population is anxious kids, and most of them are troubled by the climate crisis and believe in it completely. It's nobody doubts it. Yeah.
Thank you. And then I have another question for Natanya. Having worked in both Ontario and BC, I feel like BC is always portrayed as a very sort of green, friendly, like more sustainable portion of Canada. I guess working in BC, do you find that sometimes getting sustainable policy through or discussions about climate change, do you feel like it's received differently in BC as opposed to Ontario? Or do you find that it's very much the same?
No, like 10,000% I agree with that statement. I think in most circles that I have, both within, like healthcare settings and outside of that, most people would talk about climate change like, it's on their mind all the time. And I think even in terms of like so for example, like in the Fraser Health Authority, like they've done quite a few initiatives that I don't really see in Ontario. So yeah, I would say in BC there's way more discussion. And actually, I will also say that I struggled quite a bit when I moved back to Ontario, because I felt actually out of place. And I would bring these conversations up with other doctors and nurses, and people would not actually see the value in what I was talking about, which I thought was super weird. And I found it very hard actually to find community. And so the biggest challenge that I'm finding right now is finding a community of other healthcare practitioners within nursing, at least in Ontario, that are still doing that sort of, advocacy work. So yeah.
Thanks. With the past year with Accreditation Canada adding sustainability language to their criteria, and then on SQUIN, the quality improvement division, I guess, of Ontario surgical programs, have you noticed that things have changed a little bit at all, or not quite yet? And I guess, Natanya, I would be asking you if you notice any changes.
Was the question for me? Sorry.
Yes, sorry.
Oh, okay. Sorry, repeat that.
So Accreditation Canada has added sustainability language to hospital accreditation. So I know in my hospital, Scarborough Health Network, we really had a shift towards really actually having a green team and creating initiatives. Have you noticed anything similar where you work this past year, or still not?
There was nothing. And actually what's funny is that before I moved to BC and then went back to Ontario, we had like a green committee, and it was like basically working through like supply chain stuff and that kind of thing. But as far as I'm aware, that has stopped since the COVID-19 pandemic. And I, in terms of like the access to what I have, there are no green teams, which is very disheartening. But again, like comparing that to BC, like that is sort of the standard in most hospitals that you work at. So I found it very odd that Ontario is a little bit different.
Yeah, for sure. Hopefully we can get there as well. And
but that's not to say that other hospitals are not doing that. Like that's not to discredit, other hospitals. It's just what I've noticed and where I'm working currently.
Fair. All right. I think it's getting a little bit later And so I'm just wondering if anybody has any last minute questions they'd like to ask. Please don't be shy. You can also type it in the chat and I'd be happy to read it out for you. All right, thanks, Natasha. So thank you so much, everybody, for your time tonight. Thank you so much again, Gilly, Max, Natanya, for putting together such an amazing and comprehensive presentation about climate and anxiety and really going through the background of everything. I know that personally, when I saw the videos on like eco anxiety, eco grief, eco paralysis, I was like, oh yeah, that's me, that's me, that's me. So definitely good to have like a name for all the emotions and feelings that I have at times. So I think it was a very educational and very enlightening presentation. And I guess with that, I'd like to wish everybody a good night and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.